The Yom Kippur War of 1973 was a carefully planned war. The Arab nations who had been defeated by Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967 were still licking their wounds from that embarrassing defeat. And so they were planning and plotting what would be the best opportunity to strike again at Israel. What time of the year would be the best time? And through some careful study, mainly on the part of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, he concluded that the best day to attack Israel would be on the high holy day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. On this day, many of the Israeli soldiers would be home worshiping with their families. It was a fasting day, so those soldiers would be physically in a more weakened condition, and the focus was on their religious activities. So this was the day that the Arab nations of Egypt and Syria decided to attack Israel. It began on October 6, 1973. Egypt was able to cross the Suez Canal and mobilize their forces in the Sinai, and Syria penetrated the Golan Heights. And so Israel was initially caught off guard, and things weren't looking too good for Israel at the first. But then by October 14th, Israel was able to recover from their initial losses, and they advanced to within 56 kilometers of Damascus, the capital of Syria. So they were threatening to attack and capture Damascus. And 2 days later, on October 16th, Israel was able to cross the Suez Canal and got within 101 kilometers of Cairo and was threatening to advance on Cairo when they decided to withdraw due to pressure from the UN Security Council. The entire war lasted 18 days. Well, these are the borders just before the Egypt-Israel Peace Accord of March 26, 1979. Israel had conquered the Sinai in this war, the Yom Kippur War, so greatly expanding their territory. But in a peace treaty arranged between the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel, Israel decided to give back the Sinai to Egypt. And so the borders were pretty much back to what they were before the Yom Kippur War. So the Sinai being given back to Egypt. Let's consider the size of modern Israel so we can conceptualize just how big or how small it is. The typical description of Israel in the Bible is from the site of Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. And that distance is 235 kilometers. If we look at the width of the country up near the Sea of Galilee, it's only about 50 kilometers wide. If we go down by the Dead Sea, it's about 90 kilometers wide. So we're talking about a very small country. If we were to compare Israel to the Philippines, you can see it's not even as large as the island of Luzon. And so Israel, 20,000 square kilometers, the Philippines, 300,000. If we compare it to the United States, just a very small size in comparison with the United States, being over 9 million square kilometers compared to Israel's 20,000. If we were to compare Israel to China, again, very small compared to China's 9.5 million square kilometers. Compared to India, India's over 3 million square kilometers. So Israel is a very small country. In terms of population, compared with their neighbors, Israel has a relatively small population. In 2014, it was 8.2 million. The Palestinian Authority counts 4.4 million. The country of Jordan, 7.9. Lebanon, a little bit less. Look how large Egypt is at 86.9 million. And then Syria, Saudi Arabia, and also Iran with a very large population of almost 81 million. So in terms of population, yes, Israel ranks pretty low in terms of Middle Eastern countries. In terms of armed forces, Israel has a standing army of 175,000 with 430,000 in the reserves, so they can call them up in time of need. The Palestinian Authority is not allowed to have an army, so technically zero. Jordan, about 100,000. Lebanon, 55. Egypt, 450,000. Syria, 320,000. Saudi Arabia, 105,000. And Iran, 665,000. So the combined forces of these hostile neighbors around Israel is totally overwhelming. They greatly outnumber the number of Israeli soldiers. Well, let's look at Israel's strategy in terms of the land. What is their occupation strategy? We have to consider just how vulnerable Israel is. Israel being a small country, surrounded by hostile neighbors. And because of the technology of modern warfare, we have jet planes, we have missiles that can travel at supersonic speeds. These threats that can come upon Israel can come within minutes. So Israel is in a very threatened position. A Scud missile can reach Israel within 1 minute from Syria. Even as far away as Iran, a Shihab-3 missile can get there in 10 minutes. Fighter jets from Saudi Arabia, 15 minutes. So we're talking just a very short time before these hostile nations can launch an attack and deliver that attack in Israel. So Israel is very, very vulnerable. And that's why Israel needs good radar detection. And since radar beams travel in a straight line, they have to be in a high location or else they'll be blocked by any mountains that are between them and the target. And so this is why Israel needs the West Bank with the central mountainous spine so they can put their radar installations up high. As you can see from this diagram, if it's down low and the beam is depicted in red there, it's going to run into the central mountainous spine. Won't be able to really detect anything coming from the east. But from on top of the central mountainous spine in the West Bank, they can look out and see these hostile threats coming from the east. So the West Bank is essential for early detection radar for Israel because of the high elevation. Well, let's look at some terms so we can understand the dialogue, the discussion, because what terms you choose in describing Israel will immediately put you on one side or the other, the Israeli side or the Palestinian side. The term Israel, it's used by some Jews to designate the land that God gave them. They usually will not use the term Palestine. Palestine, on the other hand, is a term that dates from Roman times when it was a corruption of the term Philistines. And we're going to look that there really is no connection between the Philistines and the Palestinians. The Romans just kind of got that one wrong. Let's look at some of the differences between the Philistines and the Palestinians. Well, first off, quite obviously, they're spelled differently. Okay. Secondly, they lived in vastly different time periods. The Philistines lived back in Old Testament time, thrived up till the time of the Babylonian destruction. The Palestinians basically came into being around AD 135 as the Romans designated them the Palestinians, and they continue on to the present day. The homeland of the Philistines was off in Greece and Crete and Turkey and Cyprus, far away from Israel. But the Palestinians originated in Arabia, the area to the east and southeast of Israel, relatively close. And where did the Philistines live in Israel? Well, they lived along the coastal plain in biblical times. The Palestinians, on the other hand, live in the hill country in the West Bank. So pretty much the opposite of what happened in biblical times. So we see here in this graph, the Philistines lived in the Old Testament period from around 1200 BC to 580 BC, and the Palestinians lived in the modern era from around 135 AD to the present time. So they didn't even live in the same time period. These are totally different peoples, not related. And so many people confuse the Philistines with the Palestinians. Even the Romans did a long time ago. But I want you to have it clear that they are not in any way the same people. In terms of origin, the Sea Peoples, or the Philistines, came from Greece and Macedonia and Crete and migrated around the 12th century BC and ended up in places like Cyprus, Egypt, and Canaan. On the other hand, the Arabs, or the Palestinians, came from the area east and southeast of Israel. So very different areas of origin between the Philistines and the Palestinians. So in the Old Testament period, the Philistines lived along the coast. The Israelites, for the most part, lived up in the hill country. But in the modern day, in this period, the Israelis live along the coast, and the Palestinians live in the hill country for the most part. So just the opposite of what we have in the Old Testament. So please don't confuse these two peoples. They're totally distinct. How about the term Palestine? Well, this is the term used by Palestinians to designate the area that is today called by others Israel and the occupied territories. They usually won't use the term Israel. That is Palestinians. They won't use the term Israel. Judea and Samaria. Those who use this term are usually Jews wanting to emphasize the prior occupation of the land by referring to the disputed territories in biblical terms. And so to them that gives validity to their claim on the land. Occupied territories is another designation for places like the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. It's a more neutral term. It's often used by Arabs who want to emphasize while Israel may be occupying the territories such as the Golan Heights and the West Bank, the Gaza Strip's already been handed back over to the Palestinians. Even though they may occupy it, they're not the legitimate owner of those territories. So that's what the term occupied territories refers to. Well, let's talk about Jewish settlements in the West Bank. You probably heard about these in the news, and this is Israel's kind of quiet strategy to allow their people to settle in the West Bank, build up a presence and population there so that it will be almost impossible for them to be removed from the land sometime in the future. So little by little, they've been encouraging people to move into the West Bank, Jewish people to move into the West Bank, settle there, build schools, homes, and get quite settled in that area. So they want to repopulate the West Bank, which has traditionally been populated mainly by the Arabs. And so we can see in this picture some recent construction of settlements. They're all over the West Bank, and this has been going on at a fairly rapid pace. Every once in a while, some Jewish settler will be evicted from their home in the West Bank because they did not seek the proper permission to settle there. This is kind of the exception, but it makes the news. And so we see here this Jewish settler holding back this horde of officials that want to remove her from the land. And it shows the grit and determination of these Jewish settlers, because in many ways it's not safe to live in the settlements in the West Bank. Sometimes they receive threats from the Arabs who live there, the Palestinians who live there. Sometimes their children are threatened on the way to school. And so it's a very tense environment. But sometimes, maybe for publicity reasons, Israel will evict some of their own people from the West Bank. The Gaza Strip. In 2005, and up till that time period, there were many Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip, along with Arab communities. But under the leadership of President Ariel Sharon, he decided all the Jewish settlements would be removed from the Gaza Strip. So virtually overnight, they're all gone. The settlements are gone. Any Jewish presence is gone. And the Gaza Strip has been a hotbed, even almost a civil war between the different factions of the Palestinians. And the more radical faction won out, and they're now controlling the Gaza Strip. But that area continues to be a problem. They shoot makeshift rockets into Israel all the time, and Israel retaliates and goes in and bombs certain places in the Gaza Strip. So it is a real area of tension today, but it is under Palestinian control. In this map of settlements, we can see the settlements indicated in black. The brown and light brown and yellow indicate Arab areas, okay, Palestinian areas. So you can see these Jewish settlements have been deliberately started in areas throughout the West Bank that are just interspersed with the Arab communities. So Israel wants to have a Jewish presence all throughout the West Bank. In this map, we can see a little bit different color scheme. The yellow being full Palestinian control. Now you have to take that with a grain of salt, because full control doesn't mean they can have their own army. They can have artillery and heavy weapons, maybe rifles, but that's about it to protect themselves. So it's really not full control, full autonomy. Area B, the light brown area, means that Palestine has civil control, but Israel has military control. And then Area C, which is in light blue, this means there is full Israeli control. So you can see quite a bit of the area has full Israeli control. So this is the situation in the West Bank. So Israel's strategy has been to slowly, little by little, gain a presence there, so that it will become virtually impossible to ask all those settlers to leave in the future when they say, oh, we've been living here for years and years. And so that's the strategy for Israel today, to establish these settlements in the West Bank. Another strategy to protect themselves, Israel trying to protect themselves from the Palestinians, is that they've been building a border wall around the West Bank. They want to limit the flow of Palestinians in and out of the Jewish areas. Many of the roads now go around the Palestinian areas so the Jews can get to their settlements without ever having to go into Arab areas. And so they don't want to grant free access to the Arabs, many of whom work in the Jewish area of Israel. They don't want to give them free access for fear that they may stage an attack, a terrorist attack against the Jewish people. So this wall has kind of sealed them in, and there are checkpoints, and the Palestinians really, really dislike this wall. They consider it an infringement upon their freedom, and makes it very difficult for them to find employment in the Jewish areas of Israel. You can see in this map here, as of 2011, the red line indicates the separation wall that's already been completed, and virtually the entire West Bank will be surrounded by a wall, which is what you see behind me as my backdrop in this lesson. Well, let's sum up. What are the options in the Arab-Israeli conflict? In terms of the authority of Palestine, the authority of Israel, the occupation of the land, potential conflict, and world opinion. Well, the status quo, the authority of Palestine is limited. The authority of Israel is full. They pretty much call the shots. They have the military presence, military control. They can enforce their decisions. In terms of occupation of the land, there's coexistence. Both are living the land. In fact, even some of the Arabs are Israeli citizens and have the right to vote. But there's potential conflict. You have people, some of whom hate each other. There's been conflict down through the years. They're living in close proximity to each other, so there's a high. There is the potential for conflict, but it's low because of Israel's control over the situation. What does the world think of the status quo? It disagrees. It thinks that there should be two states, one for Israel, one for Palestine. So currently there's a state for Israel and none for Palestine. Well, how about the two-state theory? A Palestinian state and an Israeli state? Well, that would mean full authority for the Palestinians in their region, full for Israel in their region. Occupation of the land, well, they each would have to live only in their own state. But the potential for conflict would be high because now, since the Palestinians have full autonomy and authority, they can import as many weapons as they want, and the potential to strike against Israel would be very, very high because they're in such close proximity. But the world opinion in general is for this. They want a two-state. How about a one-state option, Palestinians only? And that would give the Palestinians full authority. Israel would have none. The Palestinians would have their land. The Jews would have to find some other place to live. Potential conflict would only be the Arabs fighting themselves, which is what happened in Gaza. What does the world think of this? Well, the world's not really for this idea of just giving the land to one group. How about one state, and Israel would be the only one to control it? So the Palestinians would have no authority. Israel would have complete authority. There'd be a state for Israel, but the Palestinians would have to move and go somewhere else. What's the potential conflict? Well, this would be the rallying point for all the Arab countries around Israel. This would be the spark that would start the next war. They would not tolerate this, and so they would immediately spring to action should Israel decide to take over all the occupied territories and kick all the Palestinians out. What's the world opinion on this? Well, the world doesn't want Israel to control everything. Basically, they think that there should be two states. But in reality, because these two peoples have had such hostility, each thinks that God gave them the land, so they have good theological reasons for why they should stay and kick out the other group. There really doesn't seem to be any good solution. The status quo, which is kind of limping along with Israel having most of the power but allowing the Palestinians the right to still exist and to live and to work, that seems to be about the only solution available. One of my professors when I was studying in Israel, Dr. Ron Netler, as he commented on the current situation in Israel, he said that there is really no viable solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Yes, that's a pretty bleak conclusion from an expert in this field, but that's the reality. And until Jesus, our Prince of Peace, returns, there really doesn't seem to be a lot of hope for the Arab-Israeli conflict. So we need to continue to pray. The Psalms tell us to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and so we need to do that.